All right, so this is going to be about an hour-long online recording of marketing research process lecture. And my suggestion would be to read chapter 2 of the textbook before watching this video, but it could work the other way too. You might just want to watch this for the next hour or so, try to get the main points, and then go back to the textbook for details. So there are going to be some days when I deviate quite a bit from the textbook, but this lecture is actually pretty consistent with what's in the textbook. But I'm just adding on some examples and a little bit more elaboration on a few points. Before getting into the content, just a quick kind of cool tool for the day that actually is going to be something that you guys might end up using on your projects. It's a pretty useful tool. So I'm going to switch over here and show this to you on the internet. It's called Wordle, Wordle.net. And if you've seen these images before on the internet where you've got a whole bunch of kind of words bundled together, that's a Wordle. And I'll explain what that's doing here. What we can do is create our own. And you can either paste in text here or you can type in a URL and it will pull text from a blog, for example, or an RSS feed. But I'm going to go ahead and paste in some text here, hit go, and we'll see what we get. So here's the output, and I'm going to make it a little bit easier to read by making all of the words horizontal and maybe changing the font to something a little easier to read. But essentially what it's doing is it's taking a whole bunch of text and helping us make a bit sense of it by aggregating all the words and looking at the words that occur the most frequently. And then it's representing those in a larger font. And so without even reading the text, you might have a bit of a sense as to where this text came from. So we're kind of using this in a backward sense because I haven't told you where the text is coming from. But if you scan over those words and you're thinking about the Dalai Lama, then you'd be right. This is actually the output if you were to paste in the text from his 1989 Nobel Peace Prize speech. All right, so you can use this the other way, which is where if you have text that you've collected on a research project, even just a bunch of interview transcripts, you can throw them in here and get this sort of very basic analysis to help you identify some of the themes that are evident in the text without even doing any formal analysis. And we'll talk about this later in the semester, but I thought this was a cool tool and maybe one that will be helpful in your projects as we move forward. All right, so learning objectives for today. First of all, we're going to be talking about two major classes of research, and that's primary and secondary research. And a quick warning, or more just kind of a way to think about this online lecture. This is probably the one lecture that has the most terminology in it, and we're going to be covering a lot of ground. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that we're going to be diving into each of the topics discussed today in various lectures. So today is going to be really touching on the whole semester, and that's why it's going to feel like a lot of terminology, and that's why I encourage you to read the textbook ahead of time. But I think it's important to sort of get a sense of how all these various pieces fit together before we do the deep dive in subsequent lectures and throughout our project. So after talking about two major classes of research, we're going to talk about the different trade-offs involved in conducting research. And you'll see pretty quickly it's more than just sort of time and effort. There are other things to consider as well. We'll talk about different research designs. These are different ways of collecting data. Then we'll talk about the research process and finally touch lightly on the major components of a research proposal. But you should probably have a pretty good sense of that from the proposal template that I gave you the other day for our project. So let's go ahead and talk about the two major classes of research. First of all, we have what we call secondary research. And this terminology trips people up a little bit. This is the search and use of information that was previously collected for some other problem, issue, or opportunity. the way I like to remember this is that I am the secondary user. So I am the secondary user of research that somebody else commissioned and executed at another point in time. So the research has already been done, it's out there, and then I go find it on the internet or I buy it from somebody. And that's what secondary research is. Primary research, on the other hand, could be conducted the same way, but it's research that I'm actually commissioning. So I'm going to collect and use information specifically commissioned for a current problem, issue, or opportunity. So what it means is I've identified a research need. I haven't found any secondary research that will satisfy that need, and so I'm actually going to initiate and conduct some new research. And so it is created primarily for me. So one of the questions is, when do we actually need to conduct research? And this is, I think, a good way to sort of think about research and when we would conduct it and what sort of research we'd be thinking about. So the first thing to think about when you have an opportunity or a problem and you need information to make a better decision is whether or not to conduct research. And just as a rule of thumb, I'm going to suggest that about 90% of the time, no research is needed. Okay? Now that's going to depend a lot on the company, how risk averse they are, the industry that they're in, etc. So for a big number of business decisions, we don't need to conduct research, secondary or primary. And I'll elaborate on that a bit more in just a second here. Secondary research. Now, it's hard to put numbers, but I'll go ahead anyway just to kind of give you a rule of thumb. We'll say that secondary research is the next type of research that you'd consider. Sorry if you can't see that, but that's 7%. So if you think you do need to do research, the next thing you want to do is see if the research has already been done. So you can go out and get secondary research. It may or may not cost you anything. And that might be sufficient to answer the questions that you have. So what that leaves us with is about, maybe 3% of the time that we're actually going to be conducting primary research because it takes time and effort. So our class is going to be focused on conducting marketing research, but I wanted to give you a way to think about it in the context of business decision making, because it's actually fairly exceptional that we'll conduct marketing research. It's important when we do it, but we don't do it all the time. So let me elaborate a little bit more on this one right here. When is no research needed? First of all, information might already be available. So you've got people in a company that have been hired for their experience, presumably for good judgment, and so a lot of times you just want to rely on that. Constraints, you might not have enough time. Maybe you need to make a decision very quickly, or you just don't have the resources to do the research. But there's some other, a little bit more subtle reasons why you might not do research. First of all, maybe it's not worth using the resources. You've got people, you've got money, but you've got limited numbers of both. And so you have to choose wisely and figure out how you're going to spend that time. If you've got people in marketing responsible for doing the marketing research, then maybe they're not working on other projects. If you're doing research that otherwise isn't necessarily needed. And the other one, and think about Apple, there's sort of a classic example here, is this idea of the risk of sharing proprietary information. So this one right here, it's not worth using the resources, is more of a value issue. Here we're saying the potential of the research isn't a value. And this is more the risk, which is that the research may have value, but there's a risk in doing it. And one of those types of risks is the risk of sharing proprietary information. So just to kind of sum it up, one way to think about when research is not going to be pursued, it's when the constraints of time and money sort of limit it, or you just don't think that there's sufficient value, or maybe there's too much risk. Now I want to elaborate on that a little bit, because I don't think it's quite that simple. That captures most of it. But I want you to think about this relationship between value and risk or uncertainty. And I'm going to try here. Sorry, it's not going to be very pretty, just to give you a bit of a graph to think about it. Okay, so over on this side, we have value of research. And here we have uncertainty. Uncertainty being just lack of information. So uncertainty about that which we need to make a good business decision. Okay? So clearly, as uncertainty increases and the value of research to address that uncertainty increases, then we're going to see a positive relationship here, right? And so that means that in essence, as uncertainty increases, we're more likely to see value in conducting research. So you'd expect that this would be sort of, monotonically increasing. But I'm going to suggest that the curve actually looks more like this. So what's going to happen is that there's sort of this sweet spot here. Let's see if I can change colors. There's a bit of a sweet spot here for research where you have a significant amount of uncertainty, things you want to learn, and there's going to be greater value in the research. But you get to a point where the uncertainty is so high that you're going to get questionable value from the research. And let me try to explain that with an example. And so what I'm going to suggest is that when the uncertainty in a given situation is too high, then I think the value of research actually can go down. So let me try to elaborate with a quick example. So this is the Herman Miller Aeron chair. And just to give you a little bit of history, before the Herman Miller Aeron chair, this is kind of what office chairs look like. And they were sort of big and bulky, but if you were a fancy executive, you would have one of these. And this is pretty sort of traditional up until through the 70s and into the early part of the 80s. Now, there are a couple problems from a design perspective with this chair. First of all, aesthetics aside, it's just not going to fit a lot of people, right? So we all come in different. So let me tell you a quick story about a classic, a now classic chair called the Herman Miller Aeron chair. And just to kind of set it up, we need to go back in time to sort of, the 1970s and 1980s. What did chairs look like? Well, this was sort of a classic chair for its era in the early 80s. So if you could afford it, you were a top executive, you would have a chair like this. And aesthetics aside, one of the issues with these older designs of chairs is that they weren't really adjustable. And so not only could you not really sort of, lean back and it didn't sort of accommodate movement, but, some people are 5'3", other people are 6'3". And so it didn't really accommodate that, right? So you can't actually move the chair up and down. You can't adjust the height of the arms, etc. Okay, so Herman Miller came along and they came up with the idea of an Aeron chair. And this is what the chair looks like today. But earlier prototypes actually looked fairly comparable. And what they decided to do, in addition to making the chair highly adjustable, so you can adjust the height and the angle and the lumbar and the arms, etc., but they decided that from an aesthetic perspective, they were going to let the user see all of these different ways that the product could be adjusted. And they thought that that would be a good thing to sort of highlight the benefits of the chair. So they took this prototype and they took it out to consumers and showed it to them, and they hated it. It didn't look familiar. It just was too strange. Then they took it out to some of their potential customers, the retailers who were going to sell the chairs, and they said, hey, that's an interesting concept, but when you finish it, in other words, when you put cloth around it, make it look like the things we're used to, then bring it back and we'll take another look. And so basically their market research told them that this chair was going to fail in the marketplace. And this was one of those few times where they just went ahead and they said, you know what, we feel so strongly about this innovative design. We think this is needed. We think it will set us apart. And we're confident it's going to work. And they moved forward with it. And it was probably the most successful chair in history, at least modern history. They were selling around $1,000 each. I think you can get them now for about $500 or $600. But most chairs today that you are familiar with have imitated this Herman Miller Aeron chair. So there are features in here that we now sort of take for granted in all office chairs, but really it was the Herman Miller Aeron that set the stage. So this is an example of when the uncertainty is very high, sometimes it's not worth doing research. And so a couple ways to think about it. One is when you're dealing with aesthetics. Aesthetics are hard to research if you're trying to do something that is very different. It doesn't mean that the initial reaction is necessarily predictive of how people will feel about the product down the road. The other time that it's really hard to do research where the uncertainty is high is when you're asking consumers to change their behavior, to do things differently. So those are two examples of when the uncertainty around the questions is so high that you may need to rely on judgment or other ways of approaching the decision, and going out and doing conducting market research may not be worth it from a value perspective. So a bit of a subtlety, but I think an important way to think about research. And that's why sometimes for really radical new ideas, paradoxically, marketing research may not be conducted. Okay? So those are the reasons why research might not be pursued. So what if you decide that you do want? So what if you decide that you do want to conduct research? Well, the first thing you should think about doing is looking to see if you can find out if there's research that's already been conducted that addresses your needs. So in other words, look for secondary research. So secondary data could have been created using any of the primary research methods, and we'll talk about those in a second. It could be qualitative research, it could be quantitative research. But by definition, it's research that exists somewhere and can either be acquired for free or purchased. And there are different sources of the secondary research. There could be internal sources. So if you work for a large enough company, they may have a marketing research area, and hopefully they would maintain a library that would have all of their previous studies. Or it may just be that there is sort of secondary data. Maybe it's not analyzed, but there could be data that exists in the company that you can go find. And at least that sort of cuts out half of the challenge of conducting research, which is collecting the data. There are also a lot of external sources, and just sort of quickly touching on some of those, there are certainly a lot of government sources, believe it or not. And the textbook has some examples of places you can go to find those. So for example, if you were doing, you wanted to do business overseas, the CIA of all people actually does quite a bit of research to understand sort of cultural and economic trends overseas, and that information is freely available on the internet. There are also a lot of commercial sources. Now that means that you're going to be paying for the data, but it's still secondary research because it's already been conducted. And so an example of that would be UPC, or Universal Product Code Scanner data, more simply called barcode data. So there are companies that buy that data from lots of different retailers, and then they aggregate it, and then you can take that data and do things like look for correlations to try to understand, for example, do people buy diapers at the same time that they buy bread? And if so, then retailers can make decisions like co-locating products, close to each other in the store. So that's data that's out there that we can go purchase. And then there's the internet, of course. A lot of information out there in the internet, which on the one hand seems like a great benefit, and it can be, but it's also a great burden because only really the best companies that know how to go out and find it are going to succeed, because otherwise it's easy to get caught up in a lot of noise out there. So a few different sources, internal and external, and overall, though, I guess we could say secondary research, in terms of advantages, is it's fast, because by definition, if the research has already been conducted, or at least the data has already been collected, then relative to primary research, you can just go out and get the data. It's also going to be low cost. It's not necessarily free. Sometimes it could be free, but at least it's going to be lower cost than sort of customized primary research or just any sort of form of primary research. So in the case of this barcode data, the companies that get that data and that sell it, they're selling it to lots of different customers, not just to you. And so that cost is usually shared across a lot of different customers. And so this research tends to be lower cost. So it's fast and lower cost, but what are some of the disadvantages? And there clearly are some, which is why we don't always rely just on secondary research. One is it may be out of date. It could be that the exact right sort of data was collected, it addresses your research objectives, but the data is a year old, and in some categories that's really going to matter. Could be too general, so it may sort of generally touch on the idea. Let's say you're in the market to make barbecue grills, but the questions that were asked in the research really don't get to the things that you're looking for. Then it may be informative, but may not directly address the research questions that you care the most about. And finally, with secondary research, there could be questions about the accuracy. You just don't know. It could be that the research was conducted very rigorously, and it is very credible research in terms of how people were recruited and the questions that were asked and the data analysis, but you just don't know because you didn't do it yourself. So there's a risk sometimes, depending on the source of information, a risk that it may not be as accurate as something you could do on your own. So let's say you decide that secondary research wasn't sufficient and you want to consider primary research. There really are three different sort of, call them designs of primary research. And I'll walk you through each of those quickly here. So first of all, there's exploratory research. Exploratory research essentially is research intended to understand a given problem or opportunity. So you may not have a sense of the variables to measure, so you can't just go out and write a survey. So think about the barbecue grill sort of case study that we looked at the other day. They didn't know what attributes were really going to be important to consumers other than the ones that were already embodied in products. And so they really wanted to identify some new insights. And so if you're really trying to explore a problem, understand it in new and unique ways, then you are conducting exploratory research. And there are different types of exploratory research, and we'll talk about those much more detail pretty soon in this class. But for now, let's just think about it this way. We can do direct research, and direct research means we're observing people. So you can go to a store and just watch people and see how they shop, for example. Or you can actually conduct interviews, talk to people individually or potentially in a group setting. And that would be, for example, in a focus group. And we'll talk about that much more detail next week. There are also indirect ways to explore. I just told you about UPC data. So in a sense, that's kind of exploratory research if you're getting the secondary data, but then you're trying to analyze it, synthesize it. So that's an indirect way of exploring and looking for insights. So you may just be exploring to look for correlations in the data. So that's exploratory research. Now, descriptive research is really research intended to quantify some things. So for example, let's say in the Grow project, you conducted the research and you found out that there were 3 or 4 attributes that you think people really care about. They care about how easy the grill is to clean. They care about how rugged it looks. They care about how much it gives them a sense of sort of being around a campfire, and they care about the price. So descriptive research would take that as a starting point and would ask specific questions so that you could understand, for example, how important, relatively speaking, are each of those attributes. And maybe that ranking is different for men between the ages of 20 and 30 and men between the ages of 30 and 40. So that would be descriptive research. You know generally what things you want to measure, but you want to quantify how much they matter, to whom, etc. Then the third type of research is causal research. In causal research, we're actually looking to see if one variable causes another variable. So here's kind of an easy example, is to think about 2 different designs for grills. And so one type of research, if we were just doing descriptive research, would be to ask people to rate each of those grills on their own, right? Now with causal research, what you're trying to do is understand if those designs will have some measurable effect that can be attributed to those designs. So if you ask people, how much are you willing to pay, and you showed one group of people one grill, and you showed another group of people another grill design, and you asked those two different groups the same question, how much would you be willing to pay for this grill? And let's say in the first design, they were willing to pay on average $70. And the second group on average was willing to pay $100, assuming those groups of people were sort of formed appropriately. And again, we'll talk about that later in the semester, how to do that. Then we could say that the design, the second design, had a measurable impact on the price that people were willing to pay. So that's an example of an experiment where we're going to manipulate the independent variable. In this case, the independent variable is the type of design. We're going to control other variables, meaning that we have similar people in the two different groups. And then we're going to measure the dependent variable, which is the outcome. In this case, is the price that people are willing to pay. So other sort of typical examples would be a taste test. You give people different products and you see if the taste affects their perception of the brand or the willingness to pay, etc. Now the advantages overall thinking about primary research are, one, is that it's going to be current. By definition, this is new research that you're conducting, so it's going to be timely, it's going to be recent. Second is it's going to be specific. If done correctly, and you're rigorous about sort of defining your research objectives, thinking through the research questions, and iterating on that, then you can end up with very specific ways of addressing the research information needs that you have. And finally, you have control over the process. And so you know that the research is accurate, assuming that you or somebody that you're hiring is following through with all of the different sort of specific best practices in conducting the research. But at least you've got visibility into how the research is being conducted. Now, clearly, however, there are also disadvantages. It takes time. So to conduct research can take, for a very quick project, a few weeks, but most research takes a few months, and some longer-term projects can take up to a year or even longer. Second is it's going to clearly use more resources to conduct the research, and even if you hire it out to a market research firm, you need to manage that process and be pretty hands-on about it. So far, when we've been talking about the disadvantages of different types of research, we've really focused on sort of time and resources. And I want to expand on that a little bit to help you understand really all the different trade-offs you're making when you're thinking about the type of research to conduct, both primary versus secondary, but also just different forms of primary research. What are the trade-offs inherent in these different methods? Sometimes it's going to be obvious what research design you need to use, and other times it's not. So these are the 5 things that I want you to think about. And this is going to come up repeatedly throughout the semester. So you want to get not just the concepts right, but really make sure that on this one you understand the terminology well. So clearly, time and cost are pretty important, but also relatively straightforward. We've talked about those. So what I want to do is elaborate on this idea of the issue of reliability, representativeness, and validity. So to do that, I'm going to switch over here to sort of a hypothetical research problem that I have. I'm trying to understand the following. Will the average American consumer purchase a tablet PC in the next 12 months? So that's my research question. So think about how you would go about conducting this research. Who would you talk to? How many of these people would you talk to? And what specifically would you ask them? Because the research question and the interview question are not going to be the same. So here's an example of the approach that you could take. Now this would be a bad approach, but we're going to use this to illustrate some of the concepts that I want you to understand. So let's say this is the research approach to answer that research question. I'm going to survey 20 William & Mary students, and I'm going to ask them, will you purchase an iPad soon? Now, intuitively, you probably get very quickly that that's flawed research. But let's look at this more specifically and be clear about what's wrong with it. So first of all, Well, the average American consumer, right? So that's what we're interested in understanding, is the behavior of the average American consumer. And what we've done here is, in our approach, we've limited our research to William and Mary students. And William and Mary students are not representative of the average American consumer. You guys are very different in some great ways, but you're not a good proxy for the average American consumer. And so this is an issue of representativeness. You're simply not representative. And so we need to make sure that the research has a sample that is representative of the overall population. And we'll talk about that concept more soon. Second, even if this were a representative group, surveying 20 just isn't enough. And we'll talk about this later in the semester when we try to quantify how many is enough. But your data is going to be all over the place. If you survey 20 students, you might find on average that maybe 70% are going to buy a tablet PC in the next 12 months. But if you survey another 20, you might find that it's only 40%. And the issue is, when you have such a small sample, the average number that you get is going to be bouncing all over the place. So that's an issue of reliability. Whatever answer you get from this research is just not reliable because your sample size is simply too small. And finally, even if you solve those problems, look at this right here. So will you purchase an iPad soon? Well, we're asking the wrong question, because we're asking here in our research, we want to understand whether or not people are going to buy a tablet PC. There are lots of different things that might qualify as a tablet PC. An iPad is not a tablet PC in the strictest sense, and there are lots of different options for buying tablet PCs. So simply put, this is just not a valid question to address our research question. So this is not a valid interview question. So that's an issue of validity. So switching back over here, hopefully now you've got a sense of all 5 of these potential trade-offs in research: issues of time, cost, reliability, representativeness, and validity. And we can go a step further and talk about maybe qualitative and quantitative research, and which of these tend to be best in each of those different kind of situations. So thinking about reliability, representativeness, and validity, which one is better? Qualitative research, where you're exploring, or quantitative research, where you're collecting data, for example, in a survey? So which do you think is better for qualitative research? Reliability, representativeness, or validity? Well, there aren't sort of hard and fast rules, but in general, I would argue that when it comes to qualitative research excels really at validity. And the whole reason for doing sort of exploratory research is that that is the best way to get insights, right? The risk is that if you don't do qualitative research and instead you use a survey, you predefine the things that people might care about by just sort of making up some attributes. And that's not going to be a very valid way of trying to understand what people really care about. Where qualitative research typically falls down is with somewhat with representativeness and certainly with reliability. So let's flip it and think about why quantitative research is good at these. Well, with quantitative research, we tend to have much larger sample sizes because we're trying to quantify, we're trying to run statistics. And so you want to have large samples, and it's a lot easier to include, let's say, 100 or 500 people in a survey than it is to interview that number of people. And so quantitative research excels at reliability. The other thing with quantitative research, and some of this is just a function of how we tend to conduct it, is that it tends to be better with representativeness. If you are interviewing just a handful of people, it's hard to get, with qualitative research, a truly representative sample to represent all of the different sort of nuances and ways in which people are different. But with the survey, if you're going to survey 100 people or 500 people, then you can make sure that your sample is representative. And we'll be talking about that later in the semester as well. And by representative, it means that you have kind of the same proportion of men versus women, different age groups, ethnicities, different lifestyles, etc. in your sample. And that's how you can be sure that your sample is going to be relatively representative of the population. So given these different strengths of qualitative and quantitative research, what to do? And this is going to be kind of the same point I was making the other day with the Walmart project sort of case that I talked about briefly in class, is that on a lot of research projects, what we'll do is combine methods so that we get the best of both worlds. So for example, if you're doing the grill project or something comparable, and actually this is kind of the approach that you guys will be using on your projects throughout this semester, what we'll do is combine both qualitative and quantitative research. And we'll start off with the front end here. For example, if we want to explore to identify customer insights, the first thing we'll want to do is conduct some secondary research to find out what other people have already learned. There's no point in conducting research if somebody else has already done it. And so this will help us become sensitized to the things potentially that people care about with grills, but maybe it's incomplete. And so then we do some primary research, such as observation or interviews, to understand further what the typical grill user owner really cares about. And from that, you might identify a handful of potential insights, but we don't know if those insights necessarily translate to the whole population. Does the whole population really care about these attributes to the degree that we think that they might from our primary research that was focused on observation or interviews? And so what we'll do as a second stage is we'll want to validate the insights generated in the qualitative research by conducting a survey. So then we can take the 5 or 6 attributes that we identified in the qualitative research and find out which of those are truly the most important, and maybe even understand things like, well, for one age group, a particular attribute is more important, yet for another age group, a different attribute is important. And then finally, you'll take those insights that have been validated and apply those to solve whatever marketing problems or opportunities you have. So this is pretty realistic, is to think about sort of different stages, and this is exactly what we'll be mimicking in our course project throughout the semester. Is you're going to start off with some secondary research. In the next week, I want you to do some background secondary research to try to better understand the research problem and to potentially identify some tentative answers to the research questions that you have in mind. Then we'll do some primary research, some potentially observation, but more than likely interviews and focus groups. And then we'll move on in the second part of the semester with developing a survey to validate whatever you learn in the first stage of research. All right, so next we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the overall research process. And these are sort of the 4 phases and all of the steps within this. So I'm going to do my best in the next probably 10 or 15 minutes to talk you through some of this. There are a lot of details, and what I want you to try to do is get the essence of it, get the logic of how these different pieces fit together. And we're going to be diving into each of these throughout the semester in much more detail in our lectures. But also, this is why I think the project is going to be so valuable, is that you're going to get to experience each of these steps. So this is going to feel like a lot, but do your best just to sort of get an overall impression of the logic of it, and then we'll dive into the details throughout the semester. So where we are right now in our projects is you're trying to determine the research problem, right? You're trying to understand what information needs you have. And one of the themes throughout that I want you to think about is that this is really much of this an iterative process. You're going to take a first pass at defining your research questions, but just drafting that as a first step on its own. You're going to want to iterate on that somewhat before we move on to the next phase. But let's go through and talk about some of these steps more specifically. So identify and clarify the information needs. So purpose of the research request. really what you want to do is be very grounded in a business problem or opportunity. And so it'll be important in your projects to take the perspective of a hypothetical client and imagine what need they would have for the information that you want to gather and how specifically they would use that information. What business problem is that going to help them address, or business opportunity is that going to help them exploit? Next is understanding the complete problem situation. And let's kind of think back to the grill research that we talked about the other day. The complete problem situation would be understanding the fact that the sales have been pretty stagnant with grills, that there's been a lot of pressure from the retailers to design the grills in a way to make them easy to transport and to pack and maybe to assemble in the store, but there really hasn't been sufficient focus on customer needs. Maybe part of understanding the complete problem situation is seeing that grill sales are down overall. Maybe people instead are migrating back into the kitchen for their summer cooking. All of that background is going to help you in coming up with the right research questions to address. So next is identifying and separating out the symptoms. So for the grill project, before that research was conducted, they probably knew they had an issue because, well, the metrics suggested that grill sales were down, their market share was down, etc. So that's going to be the business problem, but those are really symptoms. What you have to figure out, you have to hypothesize, is what are the underlying issues. So it could be that grill sales are down because prices are too high and the economy has just sort of softened and so people can't afford them. Or in the case of this case study, what they decided was that really the designs were out of date. They weren't addressing consumer needs. So when you look at the symptoms, poor sales, that doesn't really give you the answer. You still have to sort of go down, and the iceberg principle in the textbook, I think, was a good sort of metaphor for that. Next, you need to figure out what the unit of analysis is. Are we trying to do research of the individual, or is it of the household? So, for example, in the grill project, do you want to just identify who the primary grill user is in the household and focus on that person? Or maybe instead you want to interview other people and instead look at the whole household and think of that as kind of your unit of analysis, because maybe the person buying the product is not the same person that is using the product. And finally, determining the relevant variables. Now, this process that I'm walking you through right now kind of applies equally to qualitative and quantitative research, but the details are going to be different. In the case of exploratory qualitative research, you don't know what the variables are. And so trying to determine what those relevant variables are, for example, the fact that people care about being able to clean the grill top, people want it to feel like a good place to socialize around the campfire of the grill. If those are things you didn't know, then you can't determine the variables. On the other hand, it's quite possible that you can identify the things that you want to measure by conducting secondary research, in which case this would be a good point in time in the project to start to list out the different specific things that you want to measure on the project. So this is just kind of a snapshot. This was in the textbook as well. This is the metaphor of sort of starting with the symptoms, and this is usually what your boss will come to you with, or a client if you're a market research firm, and your job is to translate that into hypotheses about the underlying issues. And this is where the decisions need to be made, and this is what the research needs to ultimately address. So once you have sufficient background information on the research sort of context, then you're ready to define the research problem and questions. And this is where you guys are right now in the project. You're trying to come up with the initial research questions. And this is something that takes some time and it takes some iteration, which is why the project proposal template that I've asked you to draft as a group is really just a draft, because you're thinking on this is going to evolve. You're going to get smarter about the research context as you do some secondary research and explore the question and think about it, you're going to iterate and eventually come up with a refined set of research questions. But we have to get started. You have to sort of put something down on paper to really kind of push your thinking and to help focus the background research that you're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks. So to illustrate these first couple steps, let's go back to the grill project. This was sort of the overall kind of, first step, understanding the business problem and the background, right? The background being that we've got these grills that are kind of clumsy out there, and the designs have really been driven in many ways by retailers, and all of the grills out there kind of look the same. And so the research opportunity in this case is to identify insights that will help us develop a better grill. But then you have to translate that into research questions. And that's a real challenge. But just to illustrate, and these are the same sort of example research questions that I put in the project proposal template. These are some of the questions, the research questions that maybe they had when they did the grill project. We don't really know, but I'm taking a bit of a guess as to what they were looking for. But overall, what does grill ownership mean to consumers? Next, what are the rituals, habits, and issues associated with grill ownership? Notice here that I think they were not just focusing on sort of the acquisition, the purchase of the grill, right? So how did the consumer acquire their grill? Maybe that's important, but that's probably secondary. It's not as important. Is really understanding what the ownership and usage experience is all about, because this is where we can really innovate and add value to grills. We're not going to necessarily change sort of how they purchase it significantly, but if we can make it into something that they really see adding value in their lives, then maybe that will make them more likely to buy it in the first place. And then also potentially we want to understand how the answers to these questions depend on things like age, whether or not they own their home, gender, etc. So this would be the list of research questions, and these are not interview questions yet. This is not specifically what you would use in an interview guide when you interview a consumer or conduct a focus group, but these are the research questions that by the end of the project you want to address. And if we can address these research questions, then we believe that we can make better decisions to address the business problem or opportunity. So then, moving on to step 3, now we can be very clear about the research objectives and confirm the value of the information. So can this information be collected at all? Is it going to tell you something new? And overall, what benefits are you going to get from conducting this research? Now, it seems like this is kind of late in the process. Why are we asking these questions now in step 3? And the answer is you can't really determine the value of the research. You can't determine how difficult it's going to be to conduct, how long it's going to take, until you have the research questions defined. Which is why, if we go back a little bit, you need to have the specific list of research questions, and it takes time to iterate through that before you can really decide how difficult, challenging it's going to be, resource intensive it's going to be to conduct the research, and then make a decision about the value of the research, knowing the trade-offs, and particularly the cost. So once you've decided, presumably, that the research is worth doing, now you have to decide what research design to use. And we've talked about these already, but here's how they kind of fit into the overall research process. And at this point, it'll be self-evident. Either your research questions are specific enough that you can go straight to descriptive research, or maybe even causal research, or maybe in going through these initial steps of the project, you decide really we need to do some exploratory research. We just don't know enough yet to move forward with, for example, a survey. So determining your research design is going to be critical at this point, and that's going to really define a lot of the subsequent steps of the project. Next, you need to think about sample design and sample size. And we're going to spend an entire lecture on this fairly soon, but let me talk you through the logic of it quickly. So the first thing you need to do is to decide whether or not you're going to use a sample. So let's say our target population for the research for the GRILL project is all men between the ages of 20 and 60. Now clearly that's a lot of men. There are millions in the US alone that fit into that. And so you're not going to have or want to spend the time and resources interviewing all of those individuals in your target population. So instead what we do is we identify a sample, and that sample is a intentionally representative subgroup, and whatever we learn from the sample we hope we can extrapolate and generalize to the overall population. Now the alternative to researching a sample of consumers would be to perform a census. A census means that you actually conduct the research on every single member of the population. And that's rarely done, but it depends on the target population. So if the target population, for example, is all US households, well, we actually do conduct, the government does conduct what's referred to simply as the census to understand how many Americans there are at a given point in time and what different age groups, ethnicities, etc. And there are different reasons why that's conducted as a census, but basically it has to do with wanting to make sure that you accurately and fairly represent all of the different demographic profiles within the U.S. And so the risk of not doing a census is high. But usually with commercial research, we're just going to sample from our population. Then there are different ways to sample. There are probability methods and there are non-probability methods. And again, we're going to be talking about that in much more detail later in the semester. A probability method means that you are going to sample people, for example, randomly, so that everyone has a chance of being pulled into the research. So for example, imagine if you had a list of all 300 million Americans, and you kind of had a magic dart, and you could throw it at the list, and you do that 100 times. That would be a purely random way to sample from the population. And the good news is when we use random probability-based sampling, we can then be relatively sure that our sample is going to be representative of the population, which means we can generalize our findings. A non-probability sampling plan would be something like, well, for the GRILL research, if I talk to, let's say, 20 students on campus, they're not fully representative of the target population, but it might be for a given project good enough. It might be good enough to get me started with identifying some insights, even though I can't be sure that I can generalize those insights to the whole population. That would be a non-probability sampling plan because that sample isn't really representative of the overall population. And the next decision we need to make about the sampling design is the sample size. So how many people do we want to talk to? For qualitative research, we might want to maybe talk to 20 or 30 people per target. When you get into quantitative research, we'll talk about this more specifically soon, but typically you're talking about 100 people or more, sometimes several hundred people. But again, it depends on the objectives of the research. Next, after you figure out the sampling, you get into measurement issues and scales. And there are a few different sort of things we need to think about here, but let me just try to explain it with another example. Let's say that we want to ultimately understand whether or not people think that a GRILL is user or usable. Is it easy to use? Now, one way to ask that would be to simply ask it like that. You could say, is this GRILL easy to use? But it's kind of a vague question, and it's hard for a lot of people to answer, at least accurately. And so instead, what you might want to do is come up with 5 or 6 much more specific questions. So you could say, is it easy to light the grill? And have people rank on a scale of 1 to 10, how much they agree with the statement. Is it easy to light the grill? Another question would be, how easy is it to control the temperature of the grill? A third question would be, how easy is it to monitor the grill in terms of the food being completely cooked? Another question might be related to usage. How easy is it to clean the grill? And so you would ask 5 or 6 questions, and then you would sort of combine those, and from that you would have an average of how usable or easy to use that grill is. So that's just one example of whether to have one general question, whether to have multiple questions. And it all gets to issues related to things like validity. Are we really getting to the research question sufficiently? And again, we'll be talking about these details more later in the semester. But for now, just suffice it to say that even once you know what you want to learn, there are different ways to ask a question and different numbers of questions you could ask, and those are all important decisions as well. The next step is testing your research. And this is equally important for qualitative research and for quantitative research. So with quantitative research, when you have a survey, you want to check the survey with a handful of participants. You want to get a sense of how long it takes for them to complete the survey. You want to make sure the questions make sense, etc. But we do the same thing for qualitative research. So the focus groups and interviews that you'll be conducting, believe it or not, in a couple of weeks here, before actually doing that research with participants you recruit, you're going to want to really test out your interview questions, maybe with a couple of friends, and iterate until you make sure that you have the right set of questions, that the survey is an appropriate length, etc. All right, we're almost done going through kind of the overall research process. The next phase, phase 3, is the execution of the research. And so this means we're actually going to go out, collect the data, analyze the data, and interpret the data to go from data to information that's going to answer our research questions. And these steps are equally important for qualitative research and for quantitative research, but how we go through and conduct each of these is going to be different. So in the case of qualitative research, we're going to be conducting, for example, interviews, and we're going to transcribe the discussions, the interviews, so that we have written data. And there will be methods that you're going to learn about how to analyze that text data and turn that into insights and findings. Similarly, when we do surveys later in the semester, you're going to be creating a survey and collecting data, but now the data is going to be different. It's going to be, instead of text, it's going to be numbers. And so how we analyze the data is going to be different. We'll use statistics, and then ultimately use statistics to help us interpret that data. And then the final and critical phase 4 is all about communicating the research results. And at the end of the day, even though the statistics are critically important so that we can understand, for example, with quantitative research, what we've learned and whether or not is statistically significant, we don't necessarily focus on the statistics, at least not primarily in a final report and presentation. They're more a supporting argument, if you will. So we'll talk about this later in the semester, but you're not done when you've sort of analyzed the data, how to actually interpret that analyzed data and circle back to addressing the research questions and the research objectives in the first place is absolutely critical. And we'll be dealing with that in the last couple weeks of the semester. So we can ignore this for now. I'm going to give you guys a bit more time on this draft proposal. We'll make that probably due next Monday instead of this Friday. And likewise on the secondary research, I don't think I'm going to ask you to have that compiled by Monday. But what I would like you to do for Monday is to read Chapter 3. All right. I hope that that helped out. Again, if you haven't read the chapter, that might be a good compliment because I know this was a pretty terminology dense lecture. Thanks.